No, I don't believe there is a bubble, actually. I mean, a lot of people talk about a property bubble, but in order for you to have the circumstances for a bubble to burst, you actually need to have a number of scenarios, which I don't believe we have here. That is to say, a large number of mortgages, a large number of people who are not able to service their debt, and then a large number of financial institutions calling those in. And basically what happens when a bubble bursts is if you have, say, a 50 or 60% loan on a property and you can't afford to pay that loan, the bank will sell the property, but they're only interested in recovering the 60%. They don't care about the 40% that belongs to you. Not all bankers are like this, of course. But this is what tends to happen. This is what happened in the States when they had a major bubble burst. So when you have a huge amount of banks who are offloading property at a percentage of their value rather than their true value, that actually wipes off that whole sector from the market entirely. And that's when you get into that vicious cycle, that's when you get a property bubble bursting. And I really don't see that scenario here in Kenya.
Let me just ask you about something James brought up, and that was the perceived oversupply at the top. I know you deal a lot, especially real estate, in terms of getting deals done and getting people occupancies up. So when you look at that, is there an oversupply at the top that then we just tend to not focus our attention on the other two tiers of housing or real estate?
No, I think I agree with James. I think the oversupply is probably least serious at the very top of the market, actually. Yeah. But it's also quite an immature market, so it tends to move into and out of oversupply quite quickly between different sectors. So you're talking about gated communities, townhouses, high-end apartments, and at the moment I would say probably at the high end anyway, we are seeing an oversupply of apartments, and so developers are starting to shift their focus onto gated communities and townhouses. Yeah.
And just looking at that, obviously real estate hasn't really corrected, because we have an oversupply of perhaps apartments, we don't have enough affordable houses, and we don't have enough low-cost housing. Now, when you just look at that whole matrix, then what are some of the parameters that go into real estate that perhaps are not being addressed to help us supply adequately for all three clusters?
That's a very interesting question. Look, let's try to understand what really drives demand and what drives price here. Yeah. There's been a lot of debate around affordable housing, around mortgages, around the cost of mortgages. But I think we need to understand the key components to a house or a shelter: land availability and price of land, construction costs, which are key, but there are also the infrastructure costs related to that. So financial costs tend to really appear very frequently, but I think there are also some other elements that we need to look at. So if we can address one of these, let's take, for example, availability of land. And around land, there's all that debate about titles, about stamp duties. There's so many things that we could also do to lower the price of land. So that's one thing that we could actually try to address, and this is something that we can do both as financial institutions as well as the public sector. But we can also address construction. There is construction material, but there's also the time that people can take to construct. If you delay a project by months, years, inevitably you're running into costs. So what we need to do is also try to create a developer community that understands that just as much as they need to deliver a house, the way they construct that house, how fast they deliver, how quickly they get the supply of material in place, how they get the labor lined up, all those things could actually drive costs out of control. So that's, I think, where we really see some of the challenges. Financial costs are, of course, important, but they are also actually ultimately driven by all the other factors I mentioned.
Right. But if I was just to ask you, because right now, mega projects that are coming up, we're hearing about kind of the Two Rivers, Garden Cities. When you go around Upper Hill, all insurance firms are putting up mega structures, 28 stories and above. When you look at all these things coming into play, who's really driving that demand?
The projects that you're talking about obviously are commercial projects, so Garden City, Two Rivers and the Hub in Karen are all big retail centres. The office developments on Upper Hill are also replicated in Westlands as well, and so one could be forgiven for thinking that we're going into an oversupply in commercial space as well. And you know, that might be true in Upper Hill. It's difficult to say because there's an awful lot of supply coming into Upper Hill. But when you look at Nairobi holistically, you know, you have to look at Nairobi not as the capital of Kenya, but as the capital of East Africa. It is a regional hub, and therefore it is a two-tier market. Yeah. And so certainly in the commercial sector, we see that two-tier market in the form of large global corporations who have traditionally run sub-Saharan Africa from Johannesburg, having a regional presence here in Nairobi. So you look at a typical FMCG company like Nestle, for example. They have in their offices, they have the offices that control the national operations, but they also have the regional head office there as well. So they occupy twice as much space as they would do in, say, Uganda or Tanzania. And when you compound all of those factors together, you get a much bigger real estate on the commercial sector, particularly in offices, than you would expect. So Nairobi is disproportionately large, both in terms of the secondary cities in Kenya and also in terms of the other capital cities in the region. So it is that regional hub. If you look at Nairobi, it's the gateway into Africa from the emerging Far East, China, South Korea, India, and so on and so forth. So that is why this market can absorb so much more space than you would expect it to be able to do.
So occupancy is definitely not a problem for commercial?
Not at all. I mean, if you look at Knight Frank's office portfolio in Westlands, if you were looking for 20,000 square feet now, we'd struggle to find a building to put you in. The pipeline is coming for sure, but the demand is there, and it's a strong demand.
Yeah. Just let's look at this from a financing perspective. Last week you were in a partnership with Karibu Homes, about 2.9 billion shillings for about affordable housing. When you look at that whole matrix, how then do we bring other people on board so that they also channel funds in the right direction, just to make sure that there is adequate supply, especially for those two bottom tiers?
Well, the Karibu Homes example that we had last week at the groundbreaking ceremony, which was also attended, as you know, by the Cabinet Secretary in Charity Ngilu, that was an exemplary project. Why? I'll just highlight a number of reasons why that really stands out. We've talked about affordable, and we've talked about bringing costs down, but I think this is something that can only happen if all stakeholders really have an interest in bringing costs down. The promoters of Karibu Homes had this vision, had this idea of bringing out houses not too far from the central business district of Nairobi at a price that is lower than 2 million, yeah. and they did deliver those houses at just above 1.5 million shillings. But how did that happen? These people had a dream. When they had that dream, they didn't have a piece of land, they didn't have money for that, but they just really wanted to deliver. And they started approaching all kinds of stakeholders, from architects to financial institutions. And we shared that dream, and we believe that by putting hands together, we could actually come out with a financial product that would meet their expectations. So we didn't just work on a financial facility per se, but we looked at the designs, we looked at the timelines, we looked at the scale, which was very important because those are 1,074 units. And we told them, look, if you put all these pieces of the puzzle in place, we definitely can work with you.
So is that something perhaps, James, that needs to be replicated by other financial institutions, where they take the time to actually look at what the project is all about and look and see whether that fits into the whole arrangement?
I fully agree with you. Look, in the entire Kenyan market, we have just about 20,000 mortgages. Yeah. And that's on a population of 44 million people. That is absolutely very low. It's less than 1% almost. In advanced, more dynamic markets, you would expect to see that upwards of 5, even 10%.
I'm told that half of those mortgages are actually to bank staff as well.
So bankers are getting them at cheaper rates.
That on top of that, it's of course, as Ben rightly points out, bank staff tend to enjoy favorable rates. So you can imagine how far we still have to go. And that inevitably draws back the economy. If we could raise the number of mortgages, but it also means increasing risk appetite, which in turn means understanding what you're going into. Yeah. I think we, as Shelter Afrique, we take the time to try and understand what the project is all about. We don't just give out money. We actually provide advice, support. We even go as far as, in this case of Caribou Homes, we set up joint ventures, so we also take some risk in there. We don't just really look at giving out money and when things go wrong, try to get it back.
Right. Land banks. Last week when the wealth report was coming out, I think it was one of the things I'm adequately advised that you're mostly concerned about, especially now that Nairobi especially is running out of sufficient areas where people can put up structures. I think all those have gone. When you just look at not only Nairobi but Kenya as a whole, especially urban cities, we look at Nakuru, we look at Kisumu, we look at Mombasa. When you look at all those areas, do we have the adequate land banks that are required just to put, whether we're looking at new urban planning systems or when you're looking at commercial or when you're looking at housing?
Yeah, I think so. Obviously, the value of land, the availability of land affects its price. And obviously, if the price is higher, then it affects the project. But there is land available. You'd be surprised how much land there is available, particularly outside of Nairobi. But even in the center of Nairobi, there is an incredible number of undeveloped plots or plots that are ready to be redeveloped. So where you have a relatively high density of commercial properties, there will always be some old bungalows in there that are ready to be redeveloped. I mean, if you were looking for an acre of land, say for instance fronting Wacky Way, you might have to pay 600 million shillings for that acre. But if you have a plot ratio of 3.5, in other words, you can build 350% on that property, and you're renting that commercial space for 120 shillings a square foot, then you can afford to pay that 600 million shillings an acre. So yeah, there is land there, and so we'll see those projects carrying on.
And what I've seen perhaps happening with developers is that they actually partner with landowners rather than try and actually buy out that land. Is that a trend that perhaps can be replicated in future? Yeah,
I think that is a very good model, and actually we might see that model extend into government land as well. It would be very interesting to see more PPP, public-private partnerships, where government puts in land, particularly for types of development that are not particularly lucrative, like for instance public car parking. Public car parking in the CBD, we're not quite at a point where something like an NCP in London would be economically viable here in Nairobi, but if the government were to put in the land, perhaps the developer might then be able to build and operate that car park for 20 years, for example, and then return it back to the government at the end of that 20 years. So the government has provided a civic amenity, and in addition has benefited from receiving a building fully developed, which is only a part of the way through its functional obsolescence. It's a very good model. Obviously the government has to think beyond its 5-year cycle, as it were, because it's a long-term play. But yes, that does happen. It happens a lot. It means that people who are asset rich and cash poor, in other words landowners, can participate in the development without having to borrow or to find that money. Yeah, it's a good model.
James, when you just look at the government, I mean, obviously we tend to look at housing, so basic needs as a government function when it comes to that. But are they fully coming to the table when it comes to actually making the real estate industry more enticing to people, and how people can actually be adequately involved in trying to get affordable housing? Tied to that, when you look at something like the National Housing Corporation and its mandate, is it being fully utilized in terms of meeting that need?
Look, I won't only just look at the Kenyan situation. As you know, Shelter Afrique is the leading Pan-African bank focused on housing. So we have projects across Africa. We're seeing more and more involvement. The government is actively looking at ways in which they can partner with the private sector in finding solutions. As Ben pointed out, PPP, we think that's the way to go. If I can draw from some very concrete examples that we have both locally as well as in other countries, we have a project in Rwanda, for example, where we have linked up with the local government, and we are going to deliver 2,500 units in a very short period of time. But the same discussions we're having here too. We are talking to the central government, talking to very close contact with the CS and the housing ministry here. We are talking to the local counties and the governors, and there are ways that this can happen. I'll just give you a few examples. Lowering stamp duty. If you lower stamp duty from 4% to 2%, that can actually contribute significantly to lowering costs. Land that is owned by the government or by the local governments, that could be made available at very affordable prices or even free of charge for developers to put up houses on. So we are talking to them. I see there's a lot of curiosity and a lot of active commitment, but I think, as you rightly say, there's still a long way to go. But at least from our point of view, it is happening.
All right. There's a very interesting debate that I think is eliciting a lot of reactions, and I hear we have callers on the line, so do please bring in your calls and just join into this debate about housing and real estate and how it affects you as an individual. So perhaps looking at that, James, you've been advocate for rentals in Kenya. I don't know if it's generally for Africa. Why is that?
Look, the numbers speak for themselves. More than 80% of Kenyans, and this applies pretty much across Africa, are living in rented homes. The issue with rent is that it is principally an informal business. So what we need to do, we have to understand that there is a very big number of the population that's living in rented homes, so we need to find solutions to that. We've talked about home ownership, and I'm not saying people should not strive to buy their homes, but if you're paying, as we saw last week in the housing survey, if you're paying more than 40% of your available income for mortgages and mortgage associated expenses, then probably you are over debt. And I think people need to be comfortable with rent. It is a viable solution. And we have some of the very successful economies in the world. Germany has home ownership percentage that's less than 40%. The United States, some of the more advanced countries actually do have very advanced rented infrastructures, and there's no reason why we should not be looking at rent as a viable solution. So I think we still need to strive. Ultimately, that's our dream. We all want to have a home, but it's not a must. I think you can live a very comfortable life in a rented home.
Ben, do you buy into that idea?
Well, James, I do agree with you, but if you look at the GDPs of those countries that you've mentioned, they're very low. I mean, here in Kenya, Bloomberg is forecasting a GDP of 6% for 2015. Whilst local industry experts might think that's a bit ambitious, the fact of the matter is this economy is growing very quickly, and if you're in rented accommodation, you don't actually manage to benefit in that economic growth in the same way that you would do if you owned your property. I've been working for Knight Frank in East Africa for 16 years now, but when I was a younger man, I bought my first flat in London on a mortgage of 6%. It was an interest-only 90% mortgage, and what that enabled me to do is I was only servicing the interest. I wasn't even servicing the actual loan itself. I wasn't repaying the capital, but as the value of that property grew, every single bit of the additional value belonged to me. It didn't belong to the bank, and it didn't belong to a landlord, and even though I was quite young, I was actually benefiting from the economic growth of that country. Now, I appreciate that in this time here in Kenya, it's very, very difficult for people to do that because mortgage interest rates are so high. But I really do feel that, you know, if you are in rented accommodation, you're seeing that fantastic GDP growth in some ways slip through your fingers, and I would love to see more people be able to get onto that property ladder.
Then how do we get Kenya into the similar structures? Because I've had people say, arguing from the point of view that you should start pulling resources from a very young age, target people coming onto the job market from a very young age. From the first time they're getting into employment, hit them with a mortgage, but it has to be an affordable mortgage. Is perhaps the structure in Kenya just not in tune with home ownership and home building?
I don't think it is in tune, no.
Yeah.
I mean, the cost of borrowing is very high. I wouldn't advocate somebody going straight out of university into a mortgage anyway. I think you know, you have to get yourself into stable employment. That may take a few years. Get yourself financially solvent. There are student loans to pay off and so on and so forth. I mean, my first property was, as I said, mid to late 20s. I came out of university, I guess, when I was early 20s, so there was a few years of bedding into a work ethic, as it were, and becoming more financially stable. But no, there's no way that I could have done that if I was faced with mortgages of 14 to 16%. It would have been physically impossible.
So James, how do we get the likes of financiers such as yourself to be in tune with, perhaps, I mean, there's nothing wrong with rentals, but home ownership is obviously, everyone, I think, always aspires to own a home. It might not be the best way to go about it. So are we looking at people taking personal loans instead of mortgages to build their own houses if they have a piece of land somewhere, or how then do we go about this whole scenario?
Well, look at it this way. The countries we're living in, they're going to take some time to get to where the European and more advanced countries are. There are just some basic facts that are going to take time. Availability of information. There is a very big, actually the majority of the population in African countries are in the informal sector. You won't have data, you won't have records on income, you won't have, there's all that infrastructure that is simply missing. So you won't walk into a bank, even if you really had the money, even if you had the wealth, the banks need to have, they need to be in a situation where they can access and evaluate that kind of information. There are lots of people who have property out there, but it's just not transferable into data that can be used by the financial institutions to evaluate and come up with an appraisal that will then lead to a mortgage. So this is going to take time, and part of it is going to be through the public sector, creating identity cards, creating the data, creating all that kind of information that we will need before the banks are going to increase their risk appetite. Inevitably, that translates into higher interest rates. So those things inevitably will take some time. But at the same time, I think we need to start creating incentives for the financial institutions to lower those rates. I think these part of the blame is, I would definitely take that, is on our side. As financial institutions, we tend to maximize profits. That appears to be the virtue. But I think also the developer community, when they're putting projects up, they tend to really expect very high margins. I think it's going to be a win-win for all of us if we start really understanding that over time you may earn lower margins, but if you do it on a bigger scale, you still end up with significant margins. So I think it's, and that's why I think, and by the way, rent, I do not think that would not let you participate in the GDP. If we create a conducive environment for rent, we can actually attract long-term funds. It could be from the NSSF, or it could be from other pension funds, and that actually also drives the economy, and people who are contributing to that, who are part of that, will earn. Landlords, tenants, they could all profit from that. Lawyers who are going to create the legal infrastructure and the contracts, they'll all benefit from that. So I think there is really a viable case for that. But I agree, we also need to still maintain the dream of owning a house.
You actually brought my next question. How then do we rope in pension funds and the likes of the NSSF? Just so that there's increased cap, because they're sitting on large amounts of money that can actually be used and to fund and fuel this real estate boom that we're actually seeing.
We would not have any issue about funding a long-term project. Take a university hostel or a large apartment dedicated for rent and not necessarily built to sell. If you have the infrastructure in place, you need to know that landlords have their obligations and their rights. Tenants, the same thing. So you need to create that infrastructure to ensure that whoever's going to invest in long-term projects, because if you're building to rent, inevitably it's a very long-term thing. If you're building to sell, it's more of a mid-term prognosis. So we really need to start pushing those kinds of issues, because once you give certainty to long-term pension funds-oriented investors, they need to have oversight what's going to happen in the next 15, 20 years. They just can't look at the next 5 years. And that's what I really want to push for.
Obviously, Ben, when you look at this and some of the projects you mentioned, the Two Rivers, Garden City and the Hub, when you look at some of these buildings that are coming, it's more or less of a mixed development kind of use, where we have shopping mall, we have the houses, some people go to the extreme where we have golf courses and things like those. Is that where we are headed?
I don't think that's where we're heading as a generality. I think we will see examples of that coming up, definitely. Garden City is a very good example, the development by Actis on Thika Road, where you have the shopping centre, you also have the apartments, and also an office development as well. And so it's creating a sort of a new centre, if you like, a new node up on Thika Road. And I think one of the reasons for that is that the new Thika Superhighway, not that new now, has made that whole area very much more accessible into town, and so we're seeing Nairobi change. And so yes, I think we will see more of these schemes, but I don't see it as the way we're going, in the sense that, you know, we will do that and nothing else. But where it's appropriate, it'll happen, definitely.
In the whole matrix of urban planning, is this perhaps what is needed to get things out of more or less the CBD and actually get business activities more outside, on the outskirts of town?
Yeah, absolutely, but don't forget that's been happening for decades already. I mean, the Capital Centre, shopping centre on Mombasa Road, not very far from where we are now, was developed in 2003, more or less the same time as the Junction, which is on Dagoretti Corner. Sarat Centre was developed, what, in the 60s. So, you know, we've moved a long way away from high-rise buildings in the CBD with some retail on the ground floor, although that's still there and it's still relevant. Retail, certainly, and offices have been decentralizing for a long time now, and it's just really a development, you know, a continuation of that process.
Yeah. Just when you look at developers and the way they come up, one of the biggest challenges that when I bring in government again is that they don't actually play the role. So you find a developer who comes in and actually has to factor in the cost of building a road, the cost of doing drainage, the cost of putting water, the cost of putting up electricity. So when you add up all those costs, is perhaps this an element that is also not perhaps fully understood by the way the government notion of actually putting up developments, and how that also affects developers in terms of how they cost their projects?
Absolutely, Michael. We have a variety of issues around that. I think first and foremost, the government and the public sector should play a much bigger role in contributing to the creation of infrastructure. Everything that you mentioned, electricity, drainage, that is primarily, I think, a role that the government should at least contribute to. The other thing that then sets in is that most of the developers, unfortunately, are not yet very well equipped in planning for these things, in looking for ways at which they can lower those costs. And I also bring up another item related to that, sustainability, environmentally friendly infrastructure. Those are things that we should also be looking a lot more in. But I think also ultimately what we need to do is look at the financial institutions. I think there is, most of the financial institutions, the banks, feel comfortable in lending for mortgages. When the house is there, they feel relatively comfortable because they can easily evaluate and access it. I think where we're struggling is to find finance at the construction phase, when it gets to really assisting those developers, setting up those projects and those facilities. Most financial institutions do not really feel comfortable at analyzing those risks and taking even sharing part of those risks. And I think that's really something that we should be doing, because if that is planned well, if we can lower costs, then ultimately that should be passed on to the home buyers.
When we look at this, obviously real estate, very nice investment class for most people, but Ben, what are some of the challenges that you foresee with the real estate market? Is it all rosy, or do you see potential bottlenecks?
I mean, it depends what perspective you're looking at it from. If I'm an individual buying a house, or if I'm a pension fund that has a diversified portfolio wishing to invest in property, these are all very different perspectives. I mean, if you look at it from the point of view of a pension fund manager, he has his pension fund, he understands that he needs to diversify the risk in his portfolio that he manages. He's got his stocks, his shares, his bonds, and so on and so forth. If he invests in property, he understands that property acts as a buffer in, in other words, an otherwise volatile share market. He wants to get into property, but actually it's very difficult to do so. The reason is because, well, there's three principal reasons. The first is that he's not allowed to expose the fund into 30% of its value into any one sector. He's not allowed to invest overseas. and he has to have total control over the assets that he owns. Therefore, as a pension fund manager, he can't really invest in property in Kenya, because the only way he'd be able to do it, I mean, if he had a billion-shilling fund, he would have to spend 300 million shillings as a maximum on property. He might get, you know, an office building for that. Well, that's not diversification.
Yeah.
A third of his entire fund is in one building. That's not diversified at all. And this is where we're hoping that real estate investment trusts and other forms of unitizing property will really help investors, and not just pension fund managers, but the population at large. So what will happen is they will be able to buy chunks of a fund which is already pre-diversified, and they'll be able to buy and sell those at will. So as a pension fund, it's manna from heaven. They can invest in as much property as quickly as they like. They can get rid of it. They own it all outright, so it ticks all the boxes. And I really hope that when we do see real estate investment trusts come in, that will transform the capital markets. I think it will be a big difference.
James, is it a similar trajectory for you, or what are some of the challenges you foresee, or is what needs to be done to actually accelerate what's coming into the market?
I share Ben's view on that. I think it's a valid asset class, with the right caution to it. We've seen significant challenges, as you probably know, in the developed world. When there's too much money available, it can actually lead to disastrous consequences. What we have here is actually the contrary. We need to find ways of promoting access to finance. We need to find ways in which we can assist the financial institutions to assess risk better and take on more risk. We also need to provide more information to the buyers. Simple things. If we start making information available, what is the average price per square meter here and there, that actually helps in educating people. But we also need to help people understand what the risks are. People should not take on too much debt, even if it were available, because ultimately you just end up losing the house. Financial institutions have no intention of selling property. When they lend to you, they really want to live it through. So some people might think that when things go wrong, they just bounce in there to take your money out. That's not the intention. But at the same time, you also need to know that when you're walking into a mortgage, it's not something you're just going to walk out the day after. This is a long process. So you need to understand it's not just about the purchase price, but there are so many other associated costs and expenses that you really need to plan. Otherwise, it might really end up to be a very bad investment for you.
Obviously, Jens, this is a very interesting discussion that we have. Final thoughts on about the real estate industry. Are we where we are? Where do we need to go?
I see this primarily from the affordable area. I think we are way behind.
Yeah.
There's a huge deficit. You know the numbers. We have at least a deficit of 200,000, which means that even if today we stop producing, giving birth, and just supplied houses to existing 44 million people, would still have a deficit of 200,000, and that is growing. So that situation is really critical. If you look around, you see people living in situations that are just not acceptable. So we need to find ways of lowering prices, be it rent, be it for home ownership, to rates that people can afford. People cannot spend more than 40 or 50% of their available income on rent and mortgages. So we need to really work on this, and this is going to be something that involves both the private sector in terms of developers, in terms of buyers, as well as the financial institutions, but also the public sector has its share of the cake that we need to address.
Vision for the sector.
Well, I agree with everything that James has said. I would love to see interest rates come down, but I think the aside to that is, can you imagine what Nairobi would look like now if we had had sub 5% interest rates for the past 10 years? There would have been such a huge amount of overdevelopment. So in a sense, it's been a checks and balances system for us. But yeah, I think if we can get those interest rates down somehow, we can promote investment in real estate in the right sectors, so that we're not relying on diaspora money, which is coming in to buy these properties, but actually to fund it locally. That would be fantastic.
All right, thank you very much, gentlemen. It's been a very interesting debate. Obviously, real estate is one of those debates that we always like hearing about, and these two gentlemen, I think, have gone a long way just to explain what's really happening in Kenya and what needs to be done to get real estate development up there. James Mugera, MD Shelter African, Ben Woodham's Managing Director for Knight Franks, with a lovely debate on real estate. Now on to other business news. The frosty relations between Kenya and Tanzania appear to be thawing following President Uhuru Kenyatta's intervention over the weekend. With that intervention came the scrapping of Tanzania's move to limit Kenyan flights into the country, as well as the Kenyan government's decision to rescind a decision to lock out Tanzanian registered tour vans from accessing local airports. But with the battle line seemingly closed, where does that leave the fate of Kenyan registered tour vans still denied access into Tanzania? KTN's Charles Gitonga has the details.
This means, with immediate effect, Tanzania registered vehicles will access the Jomo Kenyatta International Airport as before, while Kenya Airways will continue with its normal operation.
An announcement originating from Windhoek, Namibia, meant to restore business normalcy as Kenya and Tanzania seek to bring to an end a diplomatic standoff. On the 6th of February 2015, Kenya's Ministry of Tourism, Commerce and East African Affairs effected a 30-year-old tourism bilateral agreement which meant that Tanzanian registered tour operators would not be allowed access into Kenya's airports, airstrips and tourism attraction sites. The move seemed only but fair for Kenya because Tanzania has not allowed Kenyan tour vans into certain parks and game reserves in the country since 1985. Efforts from the East African Secretariat to resolve the stalemate then failed as Tanzania snubbed talks on the same.
That meeting has not taken place.
Weeks later, and a budget airline FastJet is being quoted as being behind the latest diplomatic spat between the geographical neighbors, threatening to take away over 60% of Kenya Airways business to Tanzania. FastJet applied for an operation license to operate between Nairobi and Dar es Salaam in 2013 through acquisition of Fly 540, but the deal fell through. The airline could, however, not operate independently because it lacked substantial local ownership, a development that culminated in Tanzania's Civil Aviation Authority cutting the number of weekly flights by Kenya Airways to Tanzania to 14 from 42 last week. But with the two presidents having a word over the feeble relations, Kenya has decided to loosen its stand, awaiting a review of the thorny policies.
We went back to the status quo for public vehicles from Tanzania accessing our airports pending a comprehensive review.
It is a solution that appears to be a one-sided deal for Kenya, as Tanzania holds firm to the restrictive 1985 tourism agreement. However, the government does not see the attempt to limit Kenya Airways flight frequencies to Tanzania as a revengeful decision.
If it was retaliation, it should have happened immediately after the ban of Tanzanian registered public vehicles into our airport.
As part of the talks held between the two heads of state, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is expected to chair a meeting with representatives from both countries to look into the 1985 bilateral tourism agreement within 4 weeks. Also to be part of the agenda is the latest contentions of the bilateral air service agreement between the two countries. Charles Gitonga, KTN.
Obviously, those talks are expected within the next 4 weeks just to sort out those bilateral air service agreements and also the tourism bilateral agreement between the two countries. Now, sticking with tourism, the Kenya Tourism Board has launched Phase 1 of the Tourism Product Directory, an online platform showcasing Kenya's top tourist attraction sites, accommodation facilities and tour operators. The directory is aimed at giving potential tourists an easy time when planning for their trips to Kenya as an ongoing effort to revive the sector, which has been hit hard by a significant drop in international visitors. The directory includes attraction sites from the counties with a rich diversification into cultural, sports, nature and the traditional products, sandy beaches and safari products. Phase 2 of the directory, which the Tourism Board says will begin immediately, will include restaurants, tour guides and travel agencies. Also efforts to grow both domestic and international tourism. The government is set to begin global advertisement campaigns at a cost of 140 million shillings.
Launch is on. Congratulations. Congratulations. One of the things that we have always felt is that out there people think about Kenya in terms of a very narrow product line. And this is the reason why we felt, working closely under our parent ministry and also with the World Bank and the stakeholders, that we need to expand our product range and we need to talk about the attractions and the good things that are happening in this country. And this is what this directory we intended to be in terms of adding more information, especially from the counties.
This initiative, which we are launching today, complements our strategy and plans to improve our competitiveness and market Kenya as the preferred tourism destination of choice in East Africa and beyond.
Moving on, the government has voiced its growing concern for the low rate of absorption of projects under the public-private partnership model. The lack of uptake, the government warns, would delay mega infrastructure projects. But just why isn't the private sector buying into the government's idea of financing projects? Here is more on that story with Abi Agina.
When the concept of public-private partnerships was first introduced, it looked like the government had finally solved that puzzle to having mega projects implemented faster. That notion has, however, dissipated fast, with private firms yet to fully take up the opportunity to partner with the government. So far, 5 projects have been identified under the PPP framework, but only 2 have received support.
But currently, we already have a funding gap, a deficit for infrastructure amounting to about 102 billion US dollars every year. So if we wait for the government to look for that money, then this process may take some time before we expand these roads.
Kenya is currently on the verge of executing several PPP projects that could swing the nation's economy to a more developed middle-income economy. According to officials from the Ministry of Transport, local banks are yet to come to the party.
So look at these projects as corridors of development.
Decided government cannot provide all financing for the programs, and therefore it's important that the banks scale intake or uptake of the PPP projects.
The low participation by local firms could force the government to look at international avenues to source for funding in order to kickstart the projects. PPPs have been identified as some of the alternative modes of funding infrastructure projects by the Jubilee administration, with the aim of ensuring local participation. So far, projects categorized under the PPP framework include the Lamu Coal Plant, the second Nyali Bridge, as well as the Lamu Port Southern Sudan Ethiopia Transport Corridor, LAPSET, among others. In line with PPPs, the government met with contractors to chart the way forward in its agenda to bridge the huge infrastructure gaps in the country. Among some of the other PPP projects lined up is the dualling of the Nairobi-Thika Highway, Mombasa-Nairobi Highway, and Nairobi-Nakuru Highway. These projects will see investors recoup their investment through toll charges.
In last business news, obviously a lot to focus on today. Family Bank and Jubilee Insurance will be having investor conferences today just to give us their financials for 2014. So a lot to look forward to in today's business news. Now we take a short commercial break.